Lay back. Breathe slowly. And imagine a world where catching a simple cold could decide your fate. A world where the line between life and death was as thin as a single cough. This isn't a tale of kings or knights or great wars, it's about ordinary people. People who woke each morning, prayed for health, and went to sleep not knowing if they'd ever wake again. It's the story of what it truly meant to get sick in the Middle Ages. In a tiny English village, sometime around the year 1349, mist curls over the thatched rooftops. The air smells of damp hay, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of bread cooling on a stone hearth. The sun hasn't yet risen, and the only sound is the slow creaking of a wooden cart being pulled through the mud. Inside one of the cottages, a boy named Thomas stirs beneath a coarse wool blanket. He's 15, small for his age, but quick-minded, with brown hair that never seems to stay in place. His mother, Agnes, sits by the fire, crushing dried herbs in a wooden bowl. She's been awake since before dawn, watching her son's face. Thomas coughs once. A dry, hollow sound that echoes in the silence. Agnes freezes. In this world, a cough isn't just a cough. It's a shadow of something larger, a whisper that death might already be listening. Rest now, my boy, she murmurs, forcing calm into her voice. It's only the chill. You worked too long in the mill yesterday. Thomas nods, half asleep, unaware of the dread that coils behind his mother's eyes. By noon, the village is awake. Chickens scurry across the narrow lanes. Men haul sacks of grain to the watermill. The distant church bell tolls, slow, heavy, and familiar. The healer, Goodwife Ellen, walks the muddy path carrying a basket of herbs and small glass bottles. Her shawl flaps in the cold wind. She's seen too much sickness this year. Too many shrouds. Too many burials. When Agnes opens the door, Ellen's eyes go straight to the boy. Since when? She asks. Since dawn, Agnes whispers. Ellen nods. I'll do what I can. There's no doctor here. No hospitals. Just faith, herbs, and the strength of the living. She places a hand on Thomas's forehead. The skin burns beneath her palm. Fever, she says quietly. It's strong already. Agnes's eyes fill with tears. But it's just a cold. Ellen shakes her head. Maybe. Maybe not. Illness spreads faster than the wind. And once it catches the lungs, she stops herself. There's no need to finish the sentence. Outside, a group of men pass carrying a stretcher. A shape wrapped in linen rests upon it. The church bell tolls again. Thomas watches through half-closed eyes. He doesn't yet know the truth, that death is a constant companion here, one you grow up beside like a neighbor. By evening, the fever worsens. The small cottage feels both too warm and too cold at once. Candlelight flickers against the stone walls. The sound of rain pattering against the roof is steady, hypnotic. Monks, and peasants who told them were not fools. They were witnesses. Before this part ends, let's visit one final legend, one that hums quietly beneath many European folk stories, the sleeping soldier of the mountain. All across medieval Europe, from Austria to Wales, people whispered of a warrior who slept beneath the earth, waiting to rise again when his land was in danger. In England, he was King Arthur. In Germany, Emperor Barbarossa. In Portugal, King Sebastian. Different names, same dream, that the good would return when most needed. For centuries, scholars dismissed it as national myth. But modern archaeology uncovered something unexpected. In many of these legendary mountains were hidden chambers and tunnels, sometimes carved in the same century the stories first appeared. Nobody knew who built them or why. Were they tombs? Shelters? Or perhaps people really did prepare for a king's return, creating truth from faith? What we know is this: the hope that someone noble sleeps beneath us is universal. And hope, after all, is the most believable legend of them all. As candlelight fades, the monk's parchment lies open again. The ink hasn't faded. It's as if he wrote it yesterday. He ends his confession with one quiet sentence. Legends are not born from lies. They are born from memory. Maybe, in the soft corners of history, that's the secret we keep forgetting. Because the truth about medieval legends is not that people once believed too much, but that we, perhaps, stopped believing too soon. Agnes whispers prayers. Ellen crushes more herbs, rosemary, thyme, sage, anything with scent and warmth. But deep down, both women know the truth, their remedies are a fragile hope. The concept of germs won't exist for another 5 centuries. People don't yet understand infection, they believe sickness comes from bad air, curses, or divine punishment. When illness strikes, they open windows to let spirits out, hang amulets by the door, and sprinkle holy water across the bed. To them, the world itself breathes sickness, the wind, the rain, the soil. So, when Thomas's fever grows, Ellen fetches holy water from the church and burns juniper branches in the fire, their smoke curling through the air like a silent prayer. Thomas murmurs in his sleep. His skin shines with sweat. Agnes holds his hand tightly, whispering lullabies she used to sing when he was a baby. Outside, dogs howl at the distant toll of the bell. That night, the entire village feels restless. People speak of the illness returning. They've seen it before, the one that turns skin pale, lungs weak, and breath shallow. Some say it came from rats. Others, from God's anger. In truth, no one knows. But one thing everyone agrees on, once it enters a home, it rarely leaves. So, when the morning comes and Ellen knocks on the door again, half the village watches from afar, afraid to come near. Fear spreads faster than the sickness itself. Ellen kneels beside Thomas's bed. His eyes flutter open. "I'm thirsty," he whispers. Agnes helps him drink a few drops of water from a wooden cup. Ellen listens to his breathing. Each inhale sounds heavy, labored, like dragging a stone uphill. She knows what's coming. She's seen it too many times. But she can't bring herself to say the words. Instead, she presses a sprig of rosemary into Agnes's hand. "Keep this by him," she says softly. "It may comfort his spirit." Agnes nods, tears tracing the lines of her tired face. Ellen rises slowly, her joints aching. She looks out the small window, at the gray sky, the endless mud, the slow movement of people carrying on their lives. And she wonders, how many more will she lose before winter ends? As night falls, the candle burns low. Thomas's breathing slows. His mother sits motionless, afraid that if she moves, the world might break. He opens his eyes one last time. "It's cold, Mother," he murmurs. Agnes leans close, pressing her lips to his forehead. "I know, my boy. I know." Outside, the wind howls. Somewhere, another bell begins to toll. One more soul added to the count. But this isn't the end, not of Thomas's story, and not of what it means to be sick in this forgotten age, because this was more than one boy's fate. It was the story of a world unprepared for the invisible, a time when mercy, fear, and faith collided in the face of disease. And it's only just beginning. The morning after Thomas's passing was painfully still. No birds sang. No footsteps echoed along the muddy lane. Even the mill wheel, which usually turned with a rhythmic splash, had stopped, frozen by frost or by fear. Agnes sat beside the empty bed, her fingers tracing the creases in the rough linen sheets. The small room still smelled of herbs and smoke. It was as if the air refused to move, holding the last traces of her son's life inside. When she finally stepped outside, the cold air bit her cheeks. Villagers avoided her eyes. They murmured quick prayers under their breath as she passed. That was how grief worked here, quietly, behind closed doors. No one wanted to speak of the sickness, not because they didn't care, but because speaking its name was thought to summon it closer. At the far end of the lane, the church bell tolled once, a soft, single sound carried by the wind. Another life gone. Inside her hut, Goodwife Ellen ground more herbs into powder. The motion was automatic now, the scrape of pestle against stone, the dry whisper of leaves. She'd been a healer for 20 years, but never had she felt so powerless. Each new season brought new fevers, new swellings, new deaths. She did what she could, poultices, broths, prayers, but deep down, she knew she was fighting something far larger than she could see. As she crushed thyme and sage, she whispered a prayer of her own. Lord, give me strength for the living. Then came the knock. 3 soft taps, hesitant, frightened. She opened the door to find Marjorie, a woman from 2 houses down, clutching her youngest child. The boy's face was pale, his lips dry, his eyes unfocused. It's him, Marjorie said, voice trembling. It started this morning. Ellen's stomach sank. The sickness had already found its next home. She stepped aside to let them in. The days that followed blurred together. Everywhere Ellen went, there were fevers, coughs, shivering fits. The air grew thick with smoke from burning herbs and the sour tang of fear. People stopped gathering in the market. The baker closed his shop. Children vanished indoors. The village bell, once rung only for Sunday prayers, now tolled for the dead nearly every evening. And in the quiet between the bells, the whispers began. They say it came from the rats, muttered one man near the mill. No, said another. It's the well water. The Lord is punishing us for our sins. Others swore they saw ghostly lights in the woods, spirits searching for new souls to claim. No one knew the truth, and that uncertainty was its own kind of plague. In her solitude, Ellen kept tending to the sick. She walked from house to house, her shawl drawn tight, her basket lighter each day. She visited the blacksmith, who lay sweating beside his forge, the shepherd's wife, who cried softly as her infant coughed in her arms, and the priest, who refused to rest even as fever painted his face pale as parchment. Each night, she returned home, her hands trembling. She washed them in cold water, not knowing it would do nothing, that the invisible thing she fought could not be washed away. Still, she prayed. And still, she went back out each morning. Because in a world where sickness had no cure, kindness was the only medicine left. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, Agnes appeared at Ellen's door. Her eyes were hollow, her voice a whisper. It's spreading, she said. 3 houses on the south road. The widow's boy too. Ellen nodded. She didn't have the strength to pretend surprise anymore. Agnes hesitated, then stepped closer. You tried to help Thomas. You did all you could. I wanted you to know that. Ellen met her gaze, tears welling for the first time in weeks. He was a good boy, she whispered. Better than most I've known. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The fire crackled softly, the scent of burning sage filling the air. Then Ellen reached out and took Agnes's hand. Stay home now, she said gently. And keep your door closed. Promise me. Agnes nodded. But as she turned to leave, Ellen noticed something, a faint tremor in her hand, the pale sheen of sweat on her brow. Fear twisted in her chest. She wanted to call out, to tell her to come back, to rest, to let her help. But the words caught in her throat. Because deep down, she already knew. That night, Ellen couldn't sleep. The candle burned low beside her, casting shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. She thought of Thomas, of Agnes, of the countless faces she'd tended to with nothing but herbs and hope. And she wondered, would future generations remember them? Would anyone ever know their names? Outside, the wind moaned through the cracks in the shutters. The world felt ancient and fragile, as if one deep breath could shatter it. In that silence, Ellen whispered a vow to herself: if I cannot cure them, I will at least remember them. She began to write their names on scraps of parchment: Thomas, Marjorie's boy, the blacksmith, the shepherd's wife, a small act of defiance against the forgetting. Her hand trembled, ink blurring with tears, but she wrote anyway. Because remembrance, in times like these, was the only resistance left. The next morning, the church bell tolled again. And again. And again. But this time, when the sound faded, the village didn't weep or gather. They simply listened, quietly, reverently, knowing that every ring was a voice from their own hearts. The sickness had taken nearly a third of them. And yet, somehow, life went on. The mill turned once more. The baker reopened his oven. The sun rose through the mist like a promise that even in the age of darkness, there would be light again. For every life the sickness stole, another found a reason to keep going, to plant, to build, to remember. And in her small hut at the edge of the village, Ellen the healer kept writing. Names upon names, stories within stories. A record not of medicine, but of mercy. Because even in an age where sickness meant death, humanity, quiet, stubborn, and endlessly gentle, somehow endured. The sickness did not vanish overnight. It slipped away slowly, like smoke leaving a cold room, fading a little each day until people stopped counting the dead and started counting the living. By spring, the air smelled cleaner. The fields, once empty and gray, shimmered with young green shoots. Birdsong returned, tentative at first, as though even the robins were afraid to believe the silence was over. In the small village, doors that had been bolted shut for months began to open again. Children stepped outside blinking into sunlight they hadn't seen since autumn. And from the church tower, the bell rang, not for morning this time, but for Sunday prayers. Goodwife Ellen stood at the edge of the lane, basket in hand, and listened. It was the same bell that had tolled for Thomas, for Agnes, for half the village, but somehow, today, its sound carried something new. Not joy exactly. But life. The survivors looked older now. Even the young ones had eyes like those of the very old, quiet, cautious, half-dreaming. There was no feast, no grand celebration. Only small gestures, a loaf shared, a smile given, a single candle lit for those who would never return. Ellen moved from house to house again, though her basket was lighter now. Instead of medicine, she carried bread, dried apples, or cloth for mending. At one cottage, she found the widow Marjorie sitting by her door, spinning wool. The woman's youngest, the one who had nearly died, was chasing chickens in the yard, laughing. The sound startled Ellen at first. She had almost forgotten what laughter sounded like. "Your boy's strong," she said softly. Marjorie smiled faintly. "He shouldn't be alive," she whispered. "But somehow, he is." Ellen nodded. "That's reason enough to keep going." They sat together for a time, watching the boy play in the sunlight. And for the first time in many months, Ellen allowed herself to smile. But healing the living was not as simple as mending flesh. The sickness had taken more than bodies, it had taken faith. Some villagers no longer went to church. Others prayed louder than ever, desperate for meaning. A few whispered that God had abandoned them. Others believed he had simply grown tired of their voices. Ellen herself wasn't sure what she believed anymore. She still lit candles for the dead. Still whispered prayers for their souls. But sometimes, when the night was long and the wind howled like voices calling from beyond, she would ask herself a quiet question. If all our prayers were heard, why were so few answered? One cold evening, as the sun dipped behind the thatched roofs, Ellen returned to the small graveyard on the hill. Frost glittered on the grass, and the air smelled of wood smoke and snow. The church door was slightly open, candlelight spilling across the stones. Inside, she found Father Richard kneeling before the altar. His once dark hair was almost white now, his shoulders thin beneath his robe. He turned when she entered. "Ellen," he said softly. "You still walk among the living." She smiled wearily. "Barely." He rose, joints creaking, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did more good than I ever did with all my prayers." "I only gave them herbs," she said. "And hope," he replied. "Don't forget that." They stood together in silence, the candle flames flickering like breathing souls. After a while, Ellen said, "Do you ever think, perhaps it wasn't punishment?" The priest frowned. "What do you mean?" "Perhaps sickness isn't anger or judgment. Perhaps it's just the way the world moves. Like the tide, or the wind." Father Richard looked toward the altar, thinking. Then what of faith? "Maybe," she said quietly, "faith isn't about asking why. It's about surviving despite not knowing." Outside, snow began to fall, softly, slowly, blanketing the graves. Ellen walked between them, brushing her hand across the stones. Many were unmarked. Many had no names. But she remembered each one. She still carried her small parchment book of names. Its edges were frayed now, its ink smudged, but she added new lines every week. Not just for the dead, for the living, too. Because to her, survival was a kind of miracle. She wrote, Marjorie and her son. The miller's wife. Father Richard. And, at the bottom, Ellen, still walking, still remembering. The parchment fluttered in the cold wind, and for a moment, it almost looked alive. When spring finally came, it arrived all at once. The snow melted, the streams filled, and color returned to the earth like breath returning to a sleeping body. The villagers gathered in the square for the first time in nearly a year. They didn't hold a festival, they planted a tree. A single oak sapling, rooted in the same soil that had buried so many. Children carried buckets of water. Old men leaned on canes and watched silently. When Ellen stepped forward to press the soil around the young trunk, no one stopped her. She whispered, for all who came before, and all who'll come after. The people bowed their heads. And for the first time, the air in the village felt clean again, not of sickness, but of sorrow. That night, Ellen sat by her fire. The flames danced low, casting shadows across her face. She thought of Thomas, his quiet laugh, his mother's hands, and of all the others who had vanished into memory. She didn't know if future generations would ever understand what it had been like to live through such fear. But she hoped that someday, someone might look back, not with horror, but with gentleness. Because behind every number, every plague, there were faces. And behind every healer's trembling hands, there was love. Ellen closed her eyes, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. The sickness had taken much. But it had left something, too, a deeper sense of what it meant to be human. And in that quiet realization, she finally allowed herself to rest. Outside, the young oak swayed in the night wind, its branches thin but strong. Somewhere in the distance, the bell rang once, not for death, but for dawn. And as the first light crept over the village, touching rooftops and fields alike, the world felt new again. Not healed, not whole, but alive. Years passed, but time in the village seemed to move differently after the sickness. It didn't rush or shout anymore. It crept, softly, like moss over old stone, quiet, patient, and full of memory. The children who had once played barefoot in the mud were grown now. Some married. Some left for nearby towns. But many stayed, drawn by something deeper, the strange peace that had settled over their home. At the edge of the village, Ellen's hut still stood. Its walls were lined with drying herbs. The roof leaned a little more each year, yet the garden that surrounded it flourished like a second heart. There were rosemary bushes, tall and fragrant. Rows of sage, mint, lavender, and thyme. And in the far corner, a small stone bench, half covered in ivy. This was where Ellen liked to sit at dusk, notebook in her lap, writing the names of new babies born, each one proof that life had not given up. The villagers still came to her, though not with the same fear as before. They came for advice, for help with small ailments, a twisted ankle, a fever, a newborn's cough. And sometimes, they came just to talk. Ellen never turned them away. She had grown older, her hair silver now, her hands stiff with age. But her eyes, calm, gray, watchful, still carried the same steady light that had guided so many through the dark years. She taught the children about herbs the way others taught prayers. She'd kneel beside them, holding up a leaf. This, she'd say, is thyme. Good for the chest when the air turns cold. And this, she'd crush a sprig between her fingers, releasing a sharp scent, this is rosemary. It helps the heart remember. The children listened wide-eyed, their voices whispering with awe as if she were telling them secrets older than the church itself. And in a way, she was. In the evenings, after the children had gone home, Ellen would tend to her garden alone. The setting sun would paint the fields gold, and the air would hum with quiet life, bees drifting between blossoms, sparrows darting in and out of the hedges. Sometimes she'd pause, her gaze drawn to the oak tree growing near the village square, the one they'd planted after the sickness. It was tall now, its branches thick, roots spreading deep. Under that tree, children played, couples sat, and travelers rested. It had become a kind of monument, not of sorrow, but of endurance. Ellen often smiled at it from afar, whispering a soft prayer of thanks to the memory of all who had once stood where she did now. One late summer evening, as twilight deepened, a young girl knocked on Ellen's door. Her name was Emma, barely 12, with curious green eyes and a bundle of wildflowers clutched in her hands. "My mother says you can teach me," she said. Ellen smiled, setting aside her mortar and pestle. "Teach you what, child?" Emma hesitated, glancing at the rows of herbs hanging from the rafters. "Everything," she whispered. Ellen studied her, the tremor of nervous excitement in her voice, the smudge of earth on her cheek. She reminded her of herself many years ago, when she had first learned that healing wasn't just about herbs, it was about listening. "Very well," Ellen said, motioning her inside. "Let's start with the roots. They're the ones that do the real work, even though they stay hidden." Weeks passed, and Emma became a regular presence in Ellen's garden. She learned the difference between mugwort and mint, between nettle and nightshade. She learned how to steep, how to crush, how to measure by scent rather than sight. But more importantly, she learned patience. When she grew frustrated, Ellen would remind her gently, "The plants will not rush for you. Healing takes time, and so do you." Sometimes, they'd sit together on the ivy-covered bench as the sun dipped below the fields. Emma would read aloud from Ellen's parchment of names, her young voice carrying softly into the evening. "Thomas," she'd say. "Marjorie's boy. The shepherd's wife." "Each one a story," Ellen would murmur. "And every story a lesson." "What lesson?" Emma would ask. "That we are small," Ellen would reply. "But not powerless." As autumn turned the leaves golden crimson, Ellen grew weaker. She didn't speak of it, but her body knew. She tired easily, her hands shook, and some mornings she found it hard to rise from bed. Emma noticed. One evening, when Ellen coughed and leaned heavily on the table, the girl's face went pale. "You're not ill, are you?" she asked in a trembling voice. Ellen smiled faintly. "No, child. Just old. But, if you go, who will help everyone?" Ellen reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Emma's face. "Perhaps you will." The girl's eyes widened. "Me?" "You know the herbs," Ellen said softly. "You know the names. And you've learned the most important thing of all." "What's that?" "To care." Emma swallowed hard, her eyes shining in the dim light. Ellen's hand rested over the girl's heart. "Healing begins here. Always." That winter was long but not cruel. Snow blanketed the fields, the river froze, and the village huddled close around warm fires. Ellen spent most of her days by the window, watching flakes drift past like soft, white feathers. She wrote less, spoke less, but when she did, her words carried the quiet strength of someone who had seen both the worst and best of life. One morning, Emma found her sitting in her chair, her notebook open on her lap. Ellen's head had fallen slightly forward, her face peaceful, as if she had simply drifted into sleep. On the open page, in her careful, fading script, were 3 final words. "Remember the living." The church bell rang once, then twice. But this time, the sound didn't carry sorrow. The villagers gathered by the oak tree, each holding a sprig of rosemary. Emma stood at the front, hands trembling, eyes full of tears, not of grief, but of gratitude. She had buried her teacher beside the garden, under the shadow of the herbs that had fed and healed so many. And as spring returned once more, the rosemary above her grave grew tall and wild, its scent carried through the village by every passing breeze. Years later, people still spoke of Goodwife Ellen, the healer who had survived the sickness, who had written the names, who had taught others not just to treat illness, but to see the light within it. And whenever a child fell ill, or a fever swept through the valley, people went not to the church or the Lord's hall, but to Ellen's garden, now tended by Emma, who had grown into a calm, steady woman. Her hands bore the same gentleness, her eyes the same quiet fire. And on her work table lay Ellen's parchment, worn thin by time, its ink faded but its message clear. Remember the living. Because that was the truest cure of all, not a potion or a prayer, but compassion. And in a world where sickness had once meant certain death, that compassion was the first sign that humanity had begun to heal. She had buried her teacher beside the garden, under the shadow of the herbs that had fed and healed so many. And as spring returned once more, the rosemary above her grave grew tall and wild, its scent carried through the village by every passing breeze. Years later, people still spoke of Goodwife Ellen, the healer who had survived the sickness, who had written the names, who had taught others not just to treat illness, but to see the light within it. And whenever a child fell ill, or a fever swept through the valley, people went not to the church or the Lord's hall, but to Ellen's garden, now tended by Emma, who had grown into a calm, steady woman. Her hands bore the same gentleness, her eyes the same quiet fire. And on her work table lay Ellen's parchment, worn thin by time, its ink faded but its message clear. Remember the living. Because that was the truest cure of all, not a potion or a prayer, but compassion. And in a world where sickness had once meant certain death, that compassion was the first sign that humanity had begun to heal. 100 years had passed since Ellen's garden first took root at the edge of the old village. The world beyond had changed, kings had died, wars had been fought and forgotten, cities had risen with towers of stone and glass. But here, where the land met the forest, the air still carried that same scent of rosemary and rain. No one alive remembered her face now. Her name had softened into legend, spoken not as history, but as comfort. The old villagers used to say, if the wind smells of rosemary, it means the healer walks among us still. And when a storm rattled the shutters or illness crept through the valley, mothers would whisper to their children, "Don't be afraid. She'll guide the hands that heal you." The village itself had grown. There was a school now, a cobbled road, and even a small apothecary near the church, its sign painted with an oak leaf and a sprig of rosemary intertwined. Inside, shelves were lined with jars of dried herbs. Bundles of lavender hung from the beams. And at the back of the shop stood a simple wooden bench, worn smooth by years of use. It was Emma's old bench, kept by her descendants, passed down like a quiet vow. And above it, in a frame of dark oak, hung a yellowed scrap of parchment. The ink had almost vanished, but you could still make out the faint words written there long ago. Remember the living. The apothecary was run now by a young woman named Clara, the great-great-granddaughter of Emma. Her eyes were green, just like Emma's had been, and her hands carried that same calm steadiness when she worked. Every morning, she'd open the shutters and let the sunlight spill across the herbs. She loved the smell of the place, sharp and earthy, full of stories. Sometimes travelers came from far towns, curious about the old parchment. They'd point to the faded writing and ask, "Who wrote that?" Clara would smile softly. "A woman who once healed this whole valley," she'd say. Without riches, without books, only with her heart. Then, as she measured powders or wrapped herbs in paper, she'd tell them the story of Ellen, the healer of the sickness. She'd describe the dark times, how people had feared even the air they breathed, how bells had tolled day and night. She'd speak of the oak tree that still grew in the square, its roots wrapped around the past, its branches holding the sky. And she'd tell how one woman, with nothing but herbs and courage, had kept hope alive. The travelers always listened in silence. Some left with medicine, others left with something deeper, a strange, comforting feeling that maybe, even in despair, goodness could endure. Every spring, Clara would visit the old garden outside the village. Most of the huts were gone now, replaced by stone cottages and small orchards, but the patch of ground where Ellen had once lived still bloomed. The rosemary bushes grew taller than her, their scent strong and sweet. And among them, half hidden by moss, stood a small stone marker. It was simple, no title, no grand words. Just a carving of an open hand, and beneath it, a single line. For the one who stayed. Clara would kneel there, brushing away fallen leaves, whispering softly as though speaking to an old friend. "Your garden's still alive," she'd say. And so is your kindness. Then she'd pick a small sprig of rosemary, tuck it behind her ear, and carry it home, the same way Emma once had. That summer, an illness swept through the nearby towns again, nothing like the Great Plague, but enough to stir old fears. People came rushing to the apothecary, desperate and worried. Clara worked day and night, brewing tonics, mixing poultices, reading by candlelight until her eyes ached. She sent herbs to neighboring villages, sometimes with little notes tied to the bundles. For courage. For rest. For love. When exhaustion finally forced her to stop, she stepped outside, breathing in the night air. The moon hung low, soft and silver, bathing the fields in light. And for a moment, she thought she saw someone standing by the garden gate, an old woman, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, smiling gently. Clara blinked, and the figure was gone. But the scent of rosemary lingered, carried on the wind. She smiled to herself. "Still watching over us, aren't you?" she whispered. The sickness passed, as all things do. And when it was over, the people hung garlands of herbs at their doors, not out of fear, but gratitude. They sang songs of healing, soft and low, and planted rosemary along the roadsides, so the valley would always smell of hope. The oak tree in the village square stood strong as ever, its roots deep, its branches wide. Children played beneath it, laughing, chasing one another through the drifting leaves. And high on the hill, Ellen's garden swayed gently in the evening breeze, a quiet sea of green and gold, whispering with every breath of wind. Time would go on, as it always does. The world would forget names, rewrite stories, build cities. But in the hush of the countryside, in the rhythm of the earth, something of Ellen would always remain. In every healer's steady hand. In every act of mercy given freely. In every whisper that said, "Don't be afraid." Because her story wasn't just about death. It was about how, even in the darkest age, one heart could keep the light alive. So when you hear an old bell ringing softly in the distance, when the air carries the scent of rosemary, faint but familiar, remember her. Remember the woman who faced sickness not with weapons, but with kindness. Remember the healer whose faith in the living became stronger than any disease. And remember that even when history grows quiet, compassion never does. Because some lights, once lit, never fade.